Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's Staff Chat. My name is Priscilla Andrews. I'm the Clinical Manager with the Cancer Wellness Center. For those of you who are joining the Staff Chat series, for a little tongue twister there, Staff Chat series for the first time, the series was designed as a way to give people in the cancer community an opportunity to hear conversations between health professionals on various topics of interest to the cancer community. And I am very pleased today to have Doctors Bruce Brockstein and Nick Pfanzelter, I hope I got that right, Pfanzelter,
yes.
Joining us to talk about clinical trials. Dr. Brockstein is the division head of the oncology department at North Shore University HealthSystem, and Dr. Pfanzelter serves as the medical director of the clinical trials office. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I always like to just get started here, just to find out kind of what interested you guys in the field, kind of what drew you to oncology. I think I shared with you guys earlier, I'm always intrigued by that. So curious either what drew you to oncology or more specifically, kind of what draws you to being interested in clinical trials specifically.
I can start. I think actually my interests were kind of tied together. In medical school, I was fortunate to work with an oncologist who was very active in clinical trials, and I think that was where I really developed my passion for oncology. And clinically, I really enjoyed the kind of community aspect of oncology that, unlike most of what I was exposed to in medicine, cancer was something that is experienced by entire families or groups. It's pretty uncommon for someone to come to an oncologist alone. Most of the time I was seeing people coming with a spouse or partner, friends, children, so that piece of the kind of psychological aspect was really attractive. But during that rotation, I also I think I became passionate about the science and the clinical trials that really drive oncology, and seeing all these patients who needed new options, being able to take advantage of kind of the latest therapies by way of clinical trials. So I really, I saw, I think, the best of what we have to offer.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing. Appreciate that. Dr. Brockstein?
Sure. Yeah, my path to oncology was not very direct. It wasn't really a plan. I studied mechanical engineering as an undergraduate, and then kind of got lost and found my way into medicine.
They both start with M's, so you had that.
ME, right?
Yeah.
I think, right? But yeah, I thought I would be an orthopedic surgeon and do very mechanical things, and then I liked internal medicine, and thought I would be a cardiologist and work with the heart, which is a pump. And as I got ready to kind of start a career or apply for cardiology training, I realized I really liked the cancer patient and the field of cancer for some of the reasons that Dr. Pfanzelter talked about. I mean, I think you just really kind of get to know the individual over a long-term relationship. There's, besides the very interesting medical and biological issues, there's really just that great human connection between the patient family and I think the people helping to take care of them. And so that really drove me, as well as the fact that when I started 30 years ago, kind of there, although there wasn't really great treatments, it was clear that there were a lot of things in development and that research was going to drive a lot of it. So I think I saw the potential for this becoming, a field where I could contribute and where I could see some good things happen for our patients.
Yeah, well, and just, thinking about just how important research is to moving the treatment of cancer forward, as with other medical issues as well. But, I would just say anecdotally, like I work with the multiple myeloma group here at the center. And when I started running that group about 10 years ago, there was just a couple treatment options, and so exciting to see how many more treatment options there are. And that's really driven by why we're here today, right? That's only possible through people participating in clinical trials. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I kind of was going to try a little different format here as we talk, because I think what I hear a lot from people when I'm talking to them is there can be a lot of misunderstanding out there about what a clinical trial involves and what it means to be in a clinical trial. So I thought I might play a little game of true false with you guys here today to get our conversation going, if you're game for that.
Sounds good.
Sure.
Okay.
Mythbusters.
Mythbusters.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So true or false? A patient will be treated like a guinea pig.
I could take this one. Simple answer is false, but I think this is something that we often hear from patients when discussing clinical trials, and sometimes some reticence to participating, maybe in order to really explain that, I think we have to have an idea of kind of the way that we do clinical trials, or what a clinical trial might mean. And generally, if we think about drug development, so a medication that we're using as current standard of care, for the most part, it's not always a rule, but for the most part, in order to make it into our clinic, a treatment has to go through kind of 3 phases of evaluation. And so a phase 1 clinical trial is one where we're really sort of testing for safety. And so, phase 1 clinical trial is, a new medication that has maybe been, looking sort of promising in an animal model or in a lab, and we want to try and take that concept and bring it to people. And so, so they're really kind of testing what's the right dose to be giving people before we have any idea of whether or not it's going to work. And so there we're giving kind of higher doses as the trial goes on, and really looking at side effects, and hoping that the drug does what we expect and helps patients along the way. Once the kind of safe dose has been established, then that's taken to a phase 2 trial, where we can give that what we assume is a safe dose to a larger group of patients, and essentially there we're really looking for some kind of signal that it actually does what we think it does, either that it exerts a specific change in the body, or that it actually does seem to control the cancer. And then assuming that bar is reached, that it does seem to have the intended effect, then that drug is taken to a phase 3 trial where it's compared in a very rigorous fashion against the current standard of care. And so, a phase 1 trial, may involve a few dozen patients. A phase 2 trial may be 100 or 200 patients. It's very large. And a phase 3 trial is often, several hundred or even 1,000 patients. And so the concern about being a guinea pig, I think we can allay that a little bit if you think about, where things may fit in these trials. So, the patients who are on a phase 1 clinical trial, they would enter that eyes wide open, knowing that this is these are the first patients, or the first people that are getting this drug, and so they're not guinea pigs, because the drug has been tested extensively in animal models, but they are the first people to be testing it out. And then certainly a phase 2 trial is one where many people have had the medication, and we have an idea of what the safety profile is. And then a phase 3 trial is really the proving grounds, where we're really trying to show that the drug works as well as we hope or think it does. So I think that's a useful framing. But I'd say no, we would never think of a human as a guinea pig. All of this is very intentional. We're never sort of taking random compounds off the shelf and giving them to patients just to see what works. This is any clinical trial is designed, firstly with safety in mind, but also, with a goal that that we're giving a treatment that has the potential to be effective and has a potential to benefit that patient and future patients.
Well, and I think that piece, just to highlight that you mentioned earlier, is before it ever makes it to phase one, there is this basic research that happens that, as you said, we're not just pulling random compounds off the shelf, that there is indication that that medication, that formulation is going to have some positive impact on the cancer that it's trying to treat.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the reasons that I was really drawn to oncology is that there have been so many drastic changes in the way that we treat cancer in the past couple of decades. Really, the pace of drug development has been remarkable, but to the point that a phase one clinical trial now looks much different than a phase one clinical trial did, 15 or 20 years ago, where now often, the drugs that are going to a phase one clinical trial are based on such sound biological principles that we expect to see benefits. And in fact, we've even seen drug approvals from phase one clinical trials, meaning that they worked so well that that the FDA said we can go ahead and start using this in patients while we do the rest of the formal testing. So.
Well, that actually brings up a question for me, which is like, if you are doing a clinical trial and you find, wow, this is amazing results, what happens in that situation? I mean, I think you just mentioned the idea of getting like FDA approval expedited, but when you see a powerful response, does that change the kind of course of the trial, or how do you guys kind of respond to that kind of situation?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
No. I'll be happy to take this one. So, so a lot of this is set up, prospectively. First of all, as Dr. Pfanzelter mentioned, like often you'll have some sense going in, is there going to be, what's the range of the response? And set up within the parameters of the clinical trial is, when do you evaluate how well it's working? So there's statistics that are built in that would help you to see, number one, if a treatment turns out not to be effective, which is really important. In other words, if there's a trial and you anticipate treating 200 patients, but if after the first 30 or 40, it looks like it's really not going to be helpful, then that trial is stopped, so people aren't treated with ineffective therapy. And likewise,
can I just pause to highlight that just for a moment? Because I think that is a fear that I've heard of, like, what if I get in this clinical trial and it doesn't work, and maybe I've passed up something else? But really, like, if you're finding at a certain point, like, we're not getting the results we thought, then that patient is going to be taken off of that and a new treatment plan is going to be determined.
Right. So for the individual patient, after 6 or 8 or 10 weeks, whatever the point is, there's an evaluation to see if the drug is helping that individual patient. And if it is, then by all means we continue. And if it's not, then we would stop and look to something else. But from the standpoint of the actual trial, if the statistics show that the medicine is not going to be helpful, then the trial might be stopped early, even before all the planned patients are put on it. And likewise, if the trial looks to have a better outcome, then there's a means of looking at the statistics, and there's usually a body that oversees it, what's called a data monitoring committee. That committee meets and reviews the statistics. So, again, in a sample where maybe 600 patients were going to be part of the trial, comparing 2 different medications, the standard and the experimental, if it turns out that the experimental treatment is better, then the data monitoring committee may shut down the trial and say, we have all the information we need. Now we want to let this information go quicker to the Food and Drug Administration because it's so compelling that we want to get this treatment approved or make it a standard of care. So that those are kind of the boundaries to make sure that things are safe for the population of patients.
Well, and I so appreciate you bringing that up, because I think something that can come up for patients that I hear from time to time, you hear about big pharma and there being this worry of like, oh, they're just making this decision because of money or XYZ. Like there's this idea that there's this one person sitting in a room with a cigar making these decisions, metaphorically speaking. But I think you're really highlighting what a system it is, and the layers of different people that are involved in this process. And they're really being kind of these oversight to make sure, like, is this medication doing what we're hoping it will do? And if it is, great, let's make sure we get that moving forward more quickly. And if not, then we need to like back the truck up and go down a different avenue. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It is, and I think one comment I would make on concerns about big pharma is that we are certainly we are dependent on our partners in the pharmaceutical industries to have the resources to develop lots of new drugs, but clinical trials are not exclusively the purview of big pharma. So certainly, for-profit pharmaceutical companies will run a lot of clinical trials, and you're correct that they're at least in part probably largely motivated by profit, that they need to get a drug to market in order to keep their business going. But we also have cooperative groups within cancer, which are essentially these nonprofit networks of many cancer centers across the country that design clinical trials on our own. So this is exclusively independent of the pharmaceutical industry. Sometimes we partner with them in order to get access to medications that they're developing, but those are clinical trials that are really designed by practicing oncologists with a goal of answering important questions about how we should be treating our patients, with no profit motive whatsoever. And then we also sometimes have what we consider investigator-initiated trials, meaning Dr. Brockstein has a really good idea for a way a drug should be used, and he'll design a small trial on his own. So not all clinical trials are the same in terms of how they're funded and what the goals of the outcomes are.
And it's bringing to the forefront, even for me, that like when you look at a clinical trial that's being offered to you, or if you're doing your own research, there are these different pieces of information that you may be wanting to look at, like what phase trial is it, like who is it that's, I don't know if it would be called hosting or sponsoring the trial, because it's not just always a pharmaceutical company. It could be a physician that's being backed by an institution, or it could be some collaboration between different organizations that's trying to drive that research. Is that
correct?
Yeah. And I think from the patient standpoint, even asking the physician kind of, what's the goal or what's the objective of the trial, because that's actually built into the trial. From the standpoint of patient, obviously you always want to get some benefit. But as Dr. Pfanzelter was pointing out initially, the point in which the drug is in trial is really important. Something that is a phase 1 trial. For the most part, although as Nick pointed out, there are some phase 1 trials where we can expect big benefit, but commonly they're really new drugs. We really can't rightfully give a patient the expectation to say, hey, this has a very high chance of helping or X% chance of helping, because the objective, formally the objective is to figure out what's the right way to give it, what are the side effects, and then we certainly hope along the way that we see a lot of benefit, and this becomes something that moves on to phase 2 or 3. So asking the clinician, what's the goal of this trial? What are the objectives? Those objectives are actually built into the trial.
Well, and it makes me think of can I do another true false here? Because it's leading me to think of, so true or false, clinical trials are only used when I have no other options.
So I can take that. So that is also certainly false. The phase 1 clinical trials that we've brought up a couple of times, these early trials where we're testing new new drugs and really looking at kind of safety and the way that they should be administered. That's sometimes something that's reserved for when we've exhausted kind of our currently approved standard treatments. But again, fortunately, there's been such rapid drug development that we often end up in a situation where we have multiple available treatments. And so it's critical that we do clinical trials to kind of establish, should we be using these two new therapies together, or should we be using them sequentially? And so there are many, many, questions in oncology that require clinical trials to answer. That would mean that we're, asking patients to participate in a clinical trial long before they've exhausted all standard therapies. You think about, our patients with breast cancer who, with metastatic disease, may end up getting many treatments, over the course of several years. Frequently there we have to know what's the best treatment to start with, what's the right one to use first, and which one should we use second. So no, there are many clinical trials that are not simply for patients who've exhausted other therapies.
Oh, you're muted, Dr. Brockstein. Now we know. I always say, now we know it's a Zoom meeting.
I think it's great points that Dr. Pfanzelter brought up. And I think, one situation in the metastatic breast cancer setting, because there really are, many drugs that are helpful and that are useful, is a drug might have gone through phase 1 and 2 testing, and it looks like it's really going to be useful. In fact, it may look like it's going to be the very best thing available for the patient, but not available, through a prescription, but only on a clinical trial. So many of those clinical trials are then set up, and this is getting into what's called the phase 3 clinical trial, where you have a standard of care best treatment, and then you're saying, hey, is this new treatment going to be just as good or better, or maybe not as good for some reason? And that's often set up in a randomized way, where half of people are randomly assigned to receive one treatment and half are randomly assigned to receive the other. And that may be sometimes the only access to a certain drug. The nice thing about many of those trials is that if it is that you're randomized to that, to not receive the medicine, often then as a next step, you may be able to access that medicine. That's called crossing over, meaning if at first you don't get it, then you'll have a second chance of getting it. And then
the medication, that's like the new medication. So if you're on like standard of care, and then there's this new drug, if this new drug's really great, then you might hop over to the other side of the fence.
Right, exactly. If it's A versus B and B is the new one, and you get A and A doesn't work, then you still may have a chance of getting B. It's just that instead of getting it initially, you might get it 3 months later.
Well, and I think something else that can come up, I'm going to add another little true false, is if I'm on a clinical trial, I might just get a sugar pill. I might just get a placebo, and I'm not going to get a medication.
I guess that's extension maybe of what I was kind of talking about, because when you're comparing trials, there's a couple of different ways to have comparison trials, or what's called randomized trials. You can have an open label trial where if you're getting A or B, you're randomly assigned to A or B, but you actually know what you're getting. And then there's a placebo-controlled trial where you might be assigned to A or B, but you don't know if A or B is the real drug or a placebo. So those are two different ways. So within oncology, there are less placebo-controlled trials just by the nature of, for example, if you have to get an IV drug administered over 4 hours and there's pre-medications and so on, often it's not very practical to ask somebody to come in every 3 weeks, sit for 4 hours for placebo drip, give pre-medications to prevent nausea. That's not going to happen, things like that. There are situations where those happen, but there's a little bit less of them in oncology.
So it's more common that you might have, it's more common to find like an open label trial where there might be like the standard of care that's being tested at a phase 3 level, that's being tested against this new medication that's promising to see, okay, if we're really comparing, we're trying to compare almost apples to apples, kind of similar population, similar course, but we're just trying to see, then you're going to get something. It's more rare for you to be getting nothing.
Right.
Yeah,
I
sorry.
think I hear a lot. No, that it's a good point. I hear a lot from patients with concerns about placebo, um, and just that term kind of leaving them feeling that they're then not treating their cancer. That be participating in the clinical trial means that they may end up doing nothing. And I would say in oncology, that's really rare. It would be really hard to find a situation where someone has a cancer that needs treatment and they would be randomized to treatment versus placebo. I think placebos end up they do enter our clinics, but more often it's when we're looking at combinations, meaning that we already know that A is a successful drug, and we wonder if A plus B is better. And so maybe that everyone gets A, and then half of the people get B in addition, and half of the people get placebo. But they're otherwise still getting the current standard of care. Or sometimes when we have new treatments that we think might be useful, like after surgery, to help reduce the risk of a cancer returning. Sometimes that might be a situation where a placebo is used, because if there's currently no medication that's given after that surgery, then it would be reasonable to say that someone could get a placebo because the standard of care is to not give anything in that situation.
Yeah.
But generally, a placebo is never going to mean actively withholding treatment from someone that needs it.
I think that's such an important point, because I think that is, the fear or the reluctance that I hear patients talk about the most, of, not wanting to even investigate clinical trial because of fear of, like, am I somehow putting my treatment on hold? Like, I'm not going to have any control over I get treatment or not, when really the not having treatment would be either you wouldn't have gotten anything anyway, like, you're going to be on like a risk reduction medication, or the not is actually you're going to get what everybody would get if they just went to their oncologist. We're just testing if this other extra thing is going to help.
Right.
I just because I know what randomized means, but I'm just, in case, I'm curious, when you guys talk about being randomized in a trial, what does that mean for the patient?
So I guess I'll take that. So typically it's the equivalent of a coin flip, but that coin flip is done by an impartial body, which is typically a computer algorithm. So if for example there's going to be 500 patients on a trial, comparing, as maybe as Dr. Pfanzelter pointed out, treatment A versus treatment A plus B to see if the combination is better. There has to be a way to assign the patients without any bias. Let's just say, as the oncologist side might think, oh, this is going to be, a better treatment, and I want my patient on it, or the patient might think that, the same thing. There's a lot of bias if you choose your own treatment. So it has to be done in a way that, takes away any bias. Otherwise, the real evaluation of the drug with statistics won't be helpful, won't be valid. So basically, let's just say I was with the patient, and the patient, after hearing all about the trial and going through the informed consent process, and going through all of the process of what's called eligibility, that time period might be 3 days or 10 days. At that point, the clinical trial coordinator or the research nurse then would typically submit the information, put the patient's information into the sponsor's website, and then the computer generated algorithm would spit back out the answer, basically saying you get A or B. So it takes away any human bias that's done just through an algorithm.
Like, hearing you describe that, it kind of leads me to another question, because I'll admit, even for myself, I've worked with patients that have been on clinical trials, but the process of what it is to be enrolled in clinical trials, which is what you kind of started talking to, Dr. Brockstein, is a little bit of a black box to me. So I'm curious, like, what does that look like? What is it like? Somebody decides they want to apply for a clinical trial. Maybe their doctor has recommended them for a clinical trial. What does that process look like?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I think how someone arrives at a decision to participate in a clinical trial is probably varied. I would say for the most part, it's because their physician has recognized that there is a clinical trial that makes sense for that clinical situation, and has discussed it with them. But certainly sometimes, patients will hear about clinical trials through advertisements or from doing their own research. But once that decision is made, it's kind of not as simple as sending a prescription to the pharmacy like we might do with standard care. So any clinical trial will have a really kind of rigorous set of requirements for someone to participate. And this is it's set up so that essentially so that we can draw good conclusions from the data that comes from the clinical trial. But that means really strict rules about where a patient has to be in their cancer journey and what kinds of other health conditions a patient can or cannot have in order to participate. So we have a long list of what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria that are set up during the planning phases of a clinical trial, where we will say, this trial is only for patients who have metastatic breast cancer and have had one prior treatment, and no more than two prior treatments. And there may be specific age ranges. There are certainly lab parameters that have to be met, meaning we have to see that the kidney function is normal and liver function is normal. Often, in some cases, we're looking at heart function. And so we have research nurses or research coordinators that will go through this long list of requirements for every patient, and essentially ensure that they're able to that they meet all these criteria prior to participating. So that process in and of itself can take a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, and it sounds like the purpose of that is to make sure that when you're drawing conclusions based on the results of the research, that you're kind of trying to eliminate any variables. You're trying to any variables outside of those parameters that could possibly be impacted or be impacting the results. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, we really want to know that I think the benefits of doing things this way is that we end up with a pretty clear understanding of what this new treatment can accomplish. That for a very specific population, again, women with metastatic breast cancer who've had one prior chemotherapy, we know exactly what the results of this treatment might look like. And so we have to have a population of patients that look pretty similar going into it.
Yeah. Well, and this is so somebody gets into a clinical trial, right? Let's pretend we're at that place. So something that I actually just heard recently for somebody was they said, well, I'd be interested in a clinical trial, but I don't think my insurance would cover it and it would be too expensive. So true or false? We got another true or false up to bat here.
Mostly false.
Okay.
Yeah.
False with a caveat.
Yeah, no, I mean, so there's lots of different trials. So first of all, if a drug is truly experimental, not FDA approved, then that drug cost goes away right away because nobody can be charged for that. That drug is going to be provided by the sponsor. So that's a way to access the drug for free is through the trial. And then typically then, or often in those situations, the rest of the costs of care would be billed to insurance as would normally be done. Patients are coming in to get exams, to get scans, to get blood tests. And, again, depending on the trial and to some extent who the sponsor is, in some situations, those evaluations are even paid for and removed from the insurance company having to pay for it. For example, if scans are being done more frequently than they typically would be. And there's a lot of protections that are built in now, particularly through Medicare, in terms of not being able to be excluded from a trial because of insurance reasons.
So so it sounds like there may be, and maybe there's even a higher probability that there is going to be some portion of this that is going to go to billing with the insurance company, but things that would be like, they want me to have a scan, every 6 weeks instead of every 6 months. That would be where that would be built in to the study to cover the financial burden of that. That wouldn't fall necessarily on the patient.
Right. So it could get a little tricky there because part of it is what is standard. So we're usually, if we're working with the pharmaceutical company, that's a process of negotiation because we're going to say, hey, we normally wouldn't do a scan every 6 weeks. So if that is the case, then this should be paid for every other time, so that that's not going to the insurance company or the patient. But one of the benefits of clinical trials, and this has been demonstrated, in trials in research looking at clinical trials,
research about research,
yeah, is that patients actually ultimately, on average, have better outcomes. And part of that is because of the degree of monitoring and the structure of the monitoring, and in the setting of a trial, sometimes because there has to be so much evaluation of the effects on the body, blood tests, CAT scans, there may be more evaluations than in standard of care. And if a patient has co-payments related to those testing, they may have some of those payments that come to them in the context of care, just like they would. But perhaps they end up having some more blood tests or more of those co-payments. But the entirety of the trial does not end up on the patient.
Got it. I will say I just had a question that came in as we were talking here. Somebody was wondering about cancer stage and how that applies to different clinical trial phases. Like, does the stage of cancer impact what trials might be offered to you, or what stage of cancer might be a time for people to explore the availability of a trial?
Yeah, I don't think those they're necessarily tied together, other than to say, in general, with a phase 1 clinical trial, these early studies where we're again looking at safety and looking at side effects. We probably wouldn't often do that for patients with an early stage cancer. That is one that's typically more reserved for patients that have already had other treatments that aren't working as well as we hope.
Sure.
But otherwise, it's really important that we do clinical trials kind of at every step along the way. Like I had mentioned earlier, the trials that we do to help reduce the risk of recurrence of a cancer after after surgery, for example, those can be phase 2, more likely phase 3 trials. But those would still be trials that someone with an early stage cancer would potentially be able to take advantage of.
So it's not dictated by the stage of cancer that somebody has. It really just has to do with what type of trial somebody is looking at.
Yeah, I mean, it really has to do with what with where we're at in terms of the standard of care, and so again, with so many new drugs that we're kind of constantly finding new uses for, the availability of clinical trials is much greater than it was 10 years ago. But yeah, I think something a stage 2 melanoma, for example, that we may not have done anything for many years. Then all of a sudden we had a trial looking at immunotherapy that would typically be used in patients with stage 3 melanoma, and turned out it was beneficial there as well. So I think it's always a valid question for a patient to ask whether or not there are clinical trials that would be appropriate for their situation.
Well,
I think just one additional comment is not to confuse, which I think sometimes happens, the word stage and phase. So the stages and phases are completely independent. In fact, phase 1 trials more commonly would be for a stage 4 cancer. So those are totally independent things.
Yeah, a really good point. Phase and stage are not interchangeable terms,
Right.
because one is talking about where in the body the cancer is located versus phase is just talking about like where in the trajectory towards approval, if you will, is the medication. Yeah. So I just noticed the time, and so I want to ask one more true false here of you guys, and I think I already know what the answer is, which is I think what I hear sometimes is like, well, being in a clinical trial isn't going to help me. It's really about what my doctor is interested in this, or it's because the drug company, like, it's not really for my benefit.
Yeah. So I would say that's for the most part false. Now, by definition, any clinical trial, in order to ethically participate in a clinical trial, we as physicians have to feel like we don't have evidence that one treatment is better than another. Meaning, if I was convinced that treatment A was better than B, I couldn't ethically ever ask one of my patients to participate in a trial that took that decision away from me. But at the same time, so we don't know which treatment is better. But patients certainly may end up deriving benefit. And that's what we hope, is that we hope we're testing new treatments that are going to improve outcomes. And so the patients that are on clinical trials getting these new treatments first, then would stand to benefit. I think there's also I think you had said something about someone may just go on a clinical trial because that's what their doctor wants them to do. If I would hope that that's never an impression that someone is left with after meeting with a clinician. And we really want to individualize all of our treatment recommendations. But certainly, clinical trials are essential to oncology. The only reason that we have the treatments that we can talk about now is because someone was on a clinical trial in the past. So, there is always, I think, some sense that we're potentially benefiting patients in the future by participating in clinical trials now.
It's sort of a yes and, like, yes, there is the desire to push the forefront of medicine forward, and a physician isn't going to make a recommendation for a clinical trial unless they have an informed belief, let's say, that treatment is going to benefit the patient and hopefully benefit them more than the standard of care or the other options that are available.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, what have you guys found, just as a closing here, what have you found tend to be the reasons that patients you work with pursue clinical trials?
I think there's a range of it. I think sometimes there is the sense that it may possibly be the best available treatment. That happens in some phase 2, trials, and even some phase 3. Although, as Dr. Pfanzelter pointed out, we don't know that. There actually are examples where the expected treatment that's going to be better turns out not to be better or worse. But I think it's a range. I think for the most part, people want to get access to something that may help them. That's, I think, the main reason. Can I get better because of this, or get better quicker, or get better for a longer period of time? But I think a lot of patients also, will tell us that, I'm not sure if this is going to help me, but I do understand that I'm only at this point because of trials that have come before, and so I want to participate. If it may help me or may not, but doesn't seem like it's not clearly going to be harmful, then at least I want to help to move the bar forward, as a participant. And that should never really be the prime reason, and we would never ask somebody to participate for the good of the community. But I think it is it is important to kind of make that point, and people often then feel that they're doing something for themselves, and they may also be contributing to in a sense, a greater good.
Again, it's not just one or the other. It's, can this benefit me? And is there some societal good that I am going to be a part of by being in this study? Yeah. Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Pfanzelter?
No, I would echo all of that. I think patients often have different reasons, but certainly, a desire to get access to something new that that may improve their situation is often the driver. But you do hear, I take care of patients that have inherited cancer predispositions and say, my mom also had breast cancer, and I know my daughter is at higher risk for breast cancer. So I want to do what I can to make sure that we're improving things as much as possible. So sometimes I think people have multiple motivations to want to participate.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated the conversation. I feel like I learned a thing or two here this afternoon, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So I really appreciate you guys lending your expertise to our community here this afternoon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you to those of you who joined us on Zoom today, who are watching on Facebook Live, or perhaps are viewing this on our YouTube channel. I will be back here next month on June 14th. If you're interested in a conversation between myself and Lori Bombaco, our oncology dietitian, we'll be talking about nutrition-related behavior change. So welcome to join me then. Thanks again, guys. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks. Have a great day.